welcome. We are so excited to have you on this episode of the Heartbeat of Bartlett podcast. We first want to thank V2 Media. Without them, this would not be possible. So thank you, V2 Media. We love you so much. Today, we have also one of our Pinnacle sponsors. First South is our major sponsor. We could not do this without them on the podcast today. So I've got with me Miss Teresa Griffith. I'm going to let her explain who she is and what she does at First South.
Hi everybody, I am the Business Development Officer with First South Financial, and I take the credit union to companies, and also teach financial wellness classes for within companies and within the community.
Excellent, excellent. And our guest today is John Daniel. John has just written a book called Ancestral Mindset, and he's also the co-owner of Bluff City Pickleball in Bartlett. He is a staple in the city. Pickleball is one of the fastest growing sports in America. It's very exciting to be a part of that. And so we are so excited to have you on, John. If you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. Yes, I am the author of Ancestral Mindset, but I keep myself busy with Bluff City Pickleball.
That's right. Good deal. Well, we're going to dive right in. And you know, it's funny, these always go faster than we think because we have so much to cover. Yes. But what we do want to talk about first today, our focus is ancestral mindset. So John, if you would, what is the book about and what was your inspiration?
Yeah, so, you know, when I was 14 years old, my grandparents owned a gas station. So I literally started in the workforce at age 14. I think my parents skated child labor laws that way. But and then when I was a young man after that in high school, I worked at a car wash, and the owner there treated me like a son, and, you know, I got to supervise people. But fast forward the story, I ended up working in the banking industry for 47 years. And in the last 30, I was a senior HR executive for very large banking companies. And if you know anything about the banking industry, it's gone through a lot of change. You know, when I started in banking in 1975, there were 17,000 banks and a savings and loan industry. Now there are less than 5,000 banks, closer to 4,000. So there's been consolidation. And to fast forward to the story, as a senior HR executive, you get to see a lot of behavior unfold across thousands of people. And in all those years, I began to notice something, that there was a pattern in how people responded to situations. Wow. Situations of change, situations of leadership, situations of adversity. And I began to notice those patterns. And in 2002, I think, I read a book by a famous academic, Steven Pinker, called The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And to sum it all up, using Pinker's notion of the blank slate, for years, and most of the 20th century, the early enlightened philosophers thought that when we're born, our brain is a blank slate. And that, you know, culture and environment shapes all of our beliefs and our values and so forth. Well, that's not true at all. Neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and other fields have documented the fact that when you're born with a bunch of stuff already wired in. And my book tries to answer the question, what is that stuff that's wired in? And since I'm a practicing HR executive for all those years, or was a practicing HR executive, and now a leader in the community, I tried to turn it into practical advice. So it is a deeply researched book with a lot of science, but it also is a practical guide for people who are trying to lead and influence other people, so that you know, how does that stuff that's wired in impact people's behavior and how to respond to that so you're a better leader.
Wow, that's great, John. Very inspirational stuff. I love your story about how you came up and you started learning at a very young age. Yes. You probably learned a little thing or two about work ethic as well, right? Scrubbing those cars.
Yep.
Well, I can appreciate the psychological standpoint of what you're describing. My degree is at University of Memphis, and I have a degree in psychology. So I understand that a little bit. Child psychology is very important. Yes. And then also the psychology behind being a leader, right? So I used to take high-level leadership classes there, and they would teach you this is what it means to be a leader. Some people are assertive leaders. Some people are servant leaders that I think yourself is described as. You serve our community, and I think that perfectly describes you. So, Teresa, what have you got for John here?
Well, I want to dive into the book a little bit.
Right.
So what do you mean when you say that our brains have a negative bias?
Yes. So, you know, the framework that I used in writing the book, and one that really excited me when I mentioned Steven Pinker, The Blank Slate. Pinker is an evolutionary psychologist. And evolutionary psychology is this idea that we can understand human behavior from the lens of evolution by natural selection. So just as evolution shaped our bodies to be bipedal, we lost our fur, we sweat more, we have a lot of these biological features that are unique as Homo sapiens. Well, the same influences, natural selection, also shaped our brain. So we have a common ancestor with primates about 6 million years ago. So that's just so over 6 million years, we moved from a primate type species to become, through 2 million years of hominid evolution, to about 250 to 300,000 years of Homo sapiens to shape our brain. And so what evolutionary psychologists have done is used the framework of evolution to understand that in those 250,000 years as Homo sapiens, in those 2 million years, our brain was shaped mostly as hunter-gatherers on the savannah.
Interesting.
And our brain was built to live that lifestyle. And the mechanisms in our brain that are still there today, because evolution lasts it takes a long time. It takes thousands of years. And that stuff is still in there. And what evolutionary psychologists call this kind of evolutionary mismatch. So in other words, there's a bunch of stuff built into your brain that serves you well as a hunter-gatherer on the savannah, but it doesn't serve you well in a modern world. And that leads us to the first one, which is the negative bias. So our brains have a negative bias. And what that means is we're affected by negative things more than positive. We remember negative things said to us, like criticism, much more than positive things. Our brains are activated by negative things, which is why social media purveyors push a lot of negativity, because our brains respond to it. And it's very easy to explain that from the lens of evolution. If our ancestors for 2 million years didn't pay attention to some negative thing, it only takes one instance when their life ceases to exist.
Wow.
And those of our ancestors that paid attention to negative events, the hiss of a snake, the growl of a teethy monstrous creature, or any other threat, if they didn't respond to that, they wouldn't be our ancestors, because they wouldn't have survived. And we all know that evolution is about the idea that evolution our bodies and brains are shaped by the fact that those of us that live successfully in the environment, we pass our genes to the next generation.
Right.
So what's born in our brain, what's built into our brain, is a negativity bias, because it served our purpose of keeping us alive.
Wow.
Now, what happens in the modern world is we don't have a lot of threats. I mean, certainly in some environments, there are threats. So we all know about those. You can cite them in terms of living in a city, for example. But most of our reality is a social world. Yeah. And so in that social world, we have, let's say, for example, one of the examples that's used in the book is the CEO sent me the assistant to the CEO of our company, who I reported directly to, and knew very well. I mean, I had helped the board recruit him to our company. We were friends as well as colleagues for 20 years. And I get an email on a Friday morning saying, Brian wants to see you in the office on Monday. And my brain went right in, oh, heck, what did I do?
Yeah.
Or what's wrong?
Absolutely.
And that's an example of negativity bias. Anytime somebody higher in status says they want to see you or they want to give you some feedback, your instantaneous reaction is negative.
Right.
One other practical example is what two eminent psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they call this loss aversion. So Tversky and Kahneman were psychologists who actually won the Nobel Prize in economics. And the reason they did that is they proved that human beings are not rational. Classic economic theory says people make decisions based on a rational decision-making, pros and cons. We know now that that's not true at all. And one of the irrationalities is loss aversion. And that means people pay more attention to losses when making economic decisions than they do to gains, potential gains. And it's so dominant in all the research. There's so many interesting studies. A classic example would be you buy a stock for $1,000 worth of stock and it loses $200. So they do these tests where they ask people about their investment decision. What they found is that people are so overwhelmed by the loss of 200 that they don't make the right economic decision. Sure. Because they hate that loss. When you make a decision about whether you should stay in a stock, it should be on the the future earnings of that stock. What the future is, not the past.
Yeah.
But loss aversion is one of these things in our nature, and it's all related to that negativity bias. It served us well as hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
Doesn't serve us well now.
That's interesting because, I used to have an app on my phone and I would follow the stocks, right?
Yes.
And my bias would be when I saw that loss, oh my gosh, time to cut my losses, right? What's the smart thing to do?
Buy low.
Buy low, right? So there's a moment, right? There's this moment where you can become an entrepreneur and you can say, wow, I'm getting this at a discount. And it sounds like that's what you're describing,
Yeah, I think the economic decision is one based on a rational understanding what's the future value of that, not the past negative, not
Correct.
the loss.
Correct.
And that's classic economic theory, but that's not how our brain works.
Yeah.
Because of negativity.
Absolutely.
That's why the majority of people start selling everything when
Right.
they lose just a
That's
little
right.
bit.
Yep.
And it's
Right.
like, no, leave it in. Let it ride.
Leave
That
it
is-
in and be bold enough
That
to
is
buy if you
that
need
is
to.
that is part of it.
You know,
Classic mismatch.
You were talking about hunter-gathering, and I was thinking of the movie 300. There's a rite of passage,
Yes.
right? There's a scene where Gerard Butler's character is literally thrown out in the wilderness, and he has to survive with a spear. And he's greeted. Do you remember by what? A wolf.
Oh yeah, okay.
A wolf.
Yep.
And he has to defend himself, and it's fight or flight.
Yep.
So in the moment, he decides to fight.
Yep.
He gets smart. He hides in a cave, and he waits for the wolf to charge, gets stuck, and sticks him with the spear. Yeah. So I think it's a lost art. It really is. I remember when I went hunting for the first time, I didn't see a deer for 5 visits, right? What I learned is that I'm more of a gatherer. I like to get the meat, and then I like to come home and process it and cook it, right? Yeah. But there's roles for both. So I think that's very interesting. So you talked a little bit about the social aspect of this, but you describe our brains are primarily social in orientation. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Yeah, this insight came from a famous evolutionary biologist named Robin Dunbar. And Dunbar actually observed primates. And primates, particularly gorillas and apes, spend a lot of times grooming each other. And it led to, Dunbar is famous in this field of evolutionary psychology. The insight came from the fact that we usually, from the Enlightenment on, when historians and philosophers began to ask the question, why are Homo sapiens why did we come to dominate the planet? Why are we been so successful? And the answer was our powers of rationality, our problems, our ability to solve problems, complex problems. And in the Linnaean classification of species, Homo sapiens is the Latin word for wise man. Well, so we think that our powers of rationality are dominant. That's why we're so successful. But that's not really true at all. The reason we came to dominate the planet is because of our ability to collaborate and cooperate with others. Most of our 2 million years of existence as hominids were as in small groups of hunter-gatherers. And being able to stay in the group, work well with the group, collaborate with the group became important for our survival. So our brains were wired to live in a culture of small groups, right? Guess what happened if you weren't successful in paying attention to the needs and feelings of other people? You get kicked out of the group, right? And if you get kicked out of the group, your genes don't pass on and survive to the next generation. So natural selection selected brains that are very good at collaboration. If you think about most of the great successes of humankind, they are not necessarily the power of rationality. They're the power of collective group. It's the Sistine Chapel was not painted by one man. It was painted by a group. Alva Edison didn't invent the light bulb by himself. It was a group. We didn't put a man on the moon by a genius rocket scientist. It was a group collaboration. Human beings are very powerful when they work together as groups. And therefore, this notion, our brains are shaped. We care deeply about other people think about us. We work hard to collaborate. And our greatest successes have been in a group. And that's thus the essence of the book, which says our brains are primarily social. And the implications for leadership are that we have to know how do human beings perform best in groups? Well, there's certain environments and cultures that leaders need to create to get the maximum performance. And there's so many interesting studies done of groups that are not performing and groups that are high performing. And the leaders, unlike the 20th century leaders and before, who were highly autocratic, controlling, even dictatorial, those things work in the short term. But the modern leader is one who recognizes that our brains are primarily social, and you get the most productivity by improving the collaboration and the cooperation of a group.
That's fantastic. And this is a perfect segue for First South. First South's slogan is banking with friends.
Yes.
Banking with friends. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
Never pass that up.
So we're a credit union. We are made up of people. All of the people that have accounts are members. So we are one big collection of individuals who are pooling our funds and loaning it out to each other. So there's a very, very simple, old setup. And I was going to say, before you set me up, so thank you. But I was going to say,
full plug.
The social orientation within that community really has come through for you personally in a number of ways, but specifically without community, you would not be here today.
That's true. That's true. I write about that in the book, but for our listeners, my heart failed a year or two after my first wife died after a long battle with cancer. And so I'm a heart transplant recipient, 2-time open heart surgery. I lived for a year in what's called a left ventricular assist device, or an LVAD, which is a computer and a little pump that's installed in your heart to keep you alive. And I write about in the book about the heart transplantation team. Heart transplant surgery, like the examples I gave earlier, is not one brilliant surgeon. It's a team, a whole team of people in the operating room, all have individual parts to play to coordinate to make for successful surgery.
And they all have to trust each other.
They have to
do their job, to play their role.
Exactly. In fact, I interviewed for the book John Craig, a very well-known heart transplant surgeon. And the title of the chapter is called "Thinking is One Brain," which comes from Dr. John, where he said, what I try to do in that room is to get everybody thinking as one brain, because our goal is to save this person's life. And so I'm the beneficiary of highly collaborative, highly successful teams.
Wow.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Good stuff. You have a chapter in the book about status, right?
Yes.
Tell us about how status affects everyday life, and specifically how it affects your life.
Yeah, so status is a really interesting chapter. I think another one of the things that's built into our brain from our 2 million years as hominids is the idea we pay attention to status. It was really important as small groups that there were people in the group that had higher levels of status. There's a famous neuroscientist, evolutionary biologist by the name of Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a fascinating book called Behave. In his research, he shows that human beings pay attention to status in a millisecond. When we walk into a group, most of us won't even be aware of this, or if we are aware of it, we won't admit it. The first thing we do is try to figure out where we fit into the pecking order. Do these people have more power than I? How can they help me? Where do I fit in the hierarchy? And I see that on the pickleball courts, where I right away can assess, I want to play with this group because I can beat them, or I'm not going to play with this group because they're going to beat me, because it's natural in that sense. But status is wired into our brains, and wired into our brains are also these emotions like envy and scorn that serve social purposes. And what I write in the book is about why is status so much a part of our brain wiring? How does it serve us well? Status serves us well, for example, in helping clarify who has the most knowledge, who can lead the group, and how all groups perform well. High-performing teams perform well when somebody's in a clear role to set vision, set accountability, and then each person in the group fills out where they fit in the status, and it leads to high-functioning groups. So that's why it's a part of our nature. There's two forms of status. One is dominance status, and the other is prestige status. You'll get a kick out of this one. Because the question you got to ask is, why is Patrick Mahomes, why is he able to sell car insurance? Why does LeBron sell some of the products he sells? Now, you can understand why LeBron or Patrick Mahomes can sell like Gatorade. But that's called prestige dominance. So in our brains, through 2 million years of evolution, it was very important that all learning came from people that had superior knowledge. Everything we learned, there was no books, there was no writing until 5,000 years ago. So we learned from people that had knowledge and experience that benefited us. So our brains are wired to pay attention to somebody who's high in knowledge or experience. Thus, and there's something called transference, where this thing in our brain will let us pay attention to somebody who's high status in one area, even if it's not their area of expertise. That's called prestige status, and it's just part of our nature, and sometimes we're not even aware of it.
Wow. And you mentioned dominant status too. Can you explain a little bit about dominant status?
Well, human beings sort in every organization into high dominance and low dominance. And so hierarchy is built into our wiring. A lot of leaders have tried to, or even communities have tried to build communities where nobody had nobody was in charge, and there was a lot of freedom and autonomy. And what we've learned about that is autonomy is a very powerful, important human need. But in order for groups to be successful, there has to be a really logical sorting of status where somebody has the knowledge and information to help the group be successful. And so it's natural in our wiring to fall somewhere into status. What we know from history, though, is there's a lot of examples where people have pure power, raw power, and they use that to dominate the group. So that's a dark side of our nature, and it shows up even in our modern world. But in highly successful groups and organizations, this natural sorting by status serves us well as a group, which is why it's built into our wiring.
That's beautiful. Well, I can speak directly to the hierarchy that you're speaking of. We had a meeting yesterday about a pickleball tournament that the Bartlett Chamber and First South is going to be putting on. We're very excited about it. And we had a team meeting where John's team led the meeting. And, he's the man, right? He sat there quietly, humbly, and he let his team do the talking, and he let us know how this was going to go. And so I can't say enough about your character, John. You've really, you know the importance of taking your hands off the wheel so that things can get done. And so I think this is all so very interesting. But one of my favorite people in your organization is your wife, Leslie. And I think Teresa has some questions about Leslie.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So you've got a mention in your book about your beautiful wife, Leslie.
Yes.
And how what her experience was like when she was diagnosed with her own cancer journey.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the chapter is really about sort of what we call predictability. Neuroscientists say our brains are prediction machines. So the way our brains work is we're always running scenarios in our brain. This is what led us to survive as hunter-gatherers. We're surveying the environment. You got to remember, for 2 million years, the world was filled with hungry, large predators, right? Now we see them; they're off secluded in preserves, but all of our existence was in threat environments, right? Through all of human existence up until the last, couple hundred years. So our brains are constantly running predictions. That leads us in our wiring to have a high need for certainty, okay? So let me bridge the gap to what that all means in terms of Leslie. We have a high need for certainty. Uncertainty moves us to a threat state. For example, as an HR executive for many years, I got in front of people that say there's going to be a merger, there's a big change, and we all hear this saying, people don't like change because of uncertainty. Well, people don't like all change. Because some change is good, and they like that. But what they don't like is uncertainty. And particularly uncertainty where they have no control of it. Well, the story about Leslie is right after I recovered from my heart transplantation, keeping in mind that my first wife of my high school sweetheart of 40 years together died of cancer, Leslie found a lump in her breast. And I told her she needed to go see a doctor, and she did. And the doctor, the first test was very concerning. You could see the look on her face. We've got to do a deeper biopsy. Mm-hmm. And for that next couple of days or weeks, whatever the time frame was, we were a mess. Yeah. I tried to control my emotions around her, but we were a mess. Wow. And then eventually all the tests came back, and she had cancer. And then it was like a light switch went on. Okay, here's what you got to do. Right. And we got this. And it's a classic example that you see in the literature, medical literature. The worst time is not knowing. Yeah. Once you know, your brain kicks into action planning, and there are still levels of stress after that, but there's no stress like uncertainty. And I think the point I make in the book for leaders is the thing you got to understand about our nature is we don't like uncertainty. We like predictability. Our brains were wired for predictability. And so, for example, I'll give you a classic example as I close this section. When I was an HR executive and we went through a big merger, I would set up a meeting every Friday morning, and I would tell all my staff through all this time of change, every Friday morning, we're going to have a meeting at 9. If you can make it, I'll be there. I won't miss it, and I'll tell you everything I know. Well, I was the one making a lot of decisions, and we didn't have the answers. In big change, you're making up as you go along. But what you did in that situation, or what we did in that situation, was create some certainty. At least we know that John's going to be there every Friday, and all this uncertainty around us gets a little bit less uncertain because I trust him and I know he's going to tell me what he knows. And so that's a classic example of taking uncertainty.
And it's just week to week, so that at least as the week got further and further along, they knew that there were some answers coming around the corner.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Good. Yeah. John, you give a lot of practical advice to leaders. What are main points you want people in leadership roles to take away from the book?
I think there's so much that I talk about that relates to the social brain, the paying attention that social. There's two things I think are really important for all leaders to understand. Is that there's a chapter in there, for example, on autonomy. It's a very powerful need that we have. So in our nature, we have a high need for status. We like to feel important. We have a high need for autonomy. We have a high need for identity. We have our identity that we like to express. And that contrasts with the paradox of our nature is that we perform well in groups. We want to belong to groups. Often our identity comes from our group. I'm a Steeler fan. I'm a Memphian. I'm a Tigers fan. Our identity comes from our group. So there's this tension in our nature about a pull for individualism and autonomy and this pull for groups. Great leaders understand, how do I let the members of my team express their individuality, be themselves, and also then play as good group members. And there are very few leaders in my experience that understand how important it is for the leader to manage the culture of the team. Lots of leaders pay attention, let's set goals and vision and hold people accountable. That's all important, by the way. I always try to do that too. But you got to do that second part. That's the key. And I think the book tries to make the point. There's a chapter, for example, on psychological safety, the need to create an environment where people feel free to express themselves. And they can express their autonomy and do that within the context of the culture. But that would be the main thing I would want people to take away from the book.
Wow.
Well, this is the book right here. So where can people get the book, John?
Great question. So if you go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon and type in Ancestral Mindset in the book section, it'll pop right up. And locally, Novel, the independent bookstore, has a supply. In fact, we did a book signing there last Saturday, very successful. We sold, I think, over 100 books. So I'm really excited to see more people. I mean, I don't ever intend it to be a bestseller, but I hope that as many people can benefit from my 40 years of leading people.
Absolutely.
It sounds great.
Yeah, well, we appreciate the time that you've taken, John, seriously. For those of us who aren't readers, we've been educated. I'm a listener. I listen to books, right? And I have to listen to them multiple times in order to understand, and I always learn something new every time I pick up a book. So I appreciate you taking the time and joining us today. So we don't have enough time. We've done it again. We've run out of time. But we do want to talk briefly about pickleball. Is there anything special going on right now at pickleball?
Well, thank you. I did a podcast when we opened Bluff City Pickleball, and I guess my report would be that, we have two goals. One was a kind of a social goal. We wanted to bring people together in this time of polarization and loneliness. We wanted to get people mentally and physically well through the game of pickleball. And the stories there are successful. We have a newsletter. We highlight people that have lost weight, made new friends. Wow. We have a very people from all backgrounds and walks of life in our club. And our club actually is full. We actually can't accept any new members.
Wow.
Our second goal, of course, is profitability. Our main goal wasn't to make a lot of money. It was to make enough money to support this vision of bringing people together. And we're closing in on that as well. So we're excited. We saved
a new business.
We saved an old building. We actually were nominated for an award for reuse of an old building.
Yeah.
And as many people may know, we won Best New Business of 2024 at the Memphis Most. So we're very excited about what we've been able to do, and we're looking forward to doing even more with the Chamber and an upcoming pickleball tournament this spring.
That's right, and First South,
That's right.
Thinking with Friends, for sure.
That's right. And tell us where it's located.
Yes, we're located on Bartlett Boulevard. It's the old Malco $2 movie theater right there at Bartlett and Stage.
It is now the current Bluff City Pickleball.
That's right.
Bluff City Pickleball.
That's right. Well, we want to thank our friends at V2 Media for this podcast today. Without them, we could not be doing this. We also want to thank our Pinnacle sponsor, First South. Banking with Friends. Get to know their team. They will take great care of you. And John, thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you for the time, the effort, and the service you put, and the love and the passion for the mind that you put into this book. And thank you deeply from the Chamber for what you do for Bartlett. The community is better because you're here. So that's going to be it for us today. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next Heartbeat of Bartlett episode. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.